GLOBIS.
Thank you. It was Hori-san's idea. He said, this is such an important topic. We have to discuss this DFFT, data free flow with trust at G1 Global. And this is going to be a very interesting discussion. As you probably know, this concept or this notion was first mentioned by Prime Minister Abe. I think it was Davos, wasn't it? And I don't think this was a really new idea in terms of what the governments and countries should do in terms of facilitating free flow. But combining free flow of data with trust, that was sort of an interesting notion. And then subsequently after the Davos conference, G20, which has been chaired by Japan this year, has taken up this very important topic as their agenda, on their agenda. So this was heavily discussed throughout the year, especially the first half of the year, and it was included in the summit agenda as well. Very difficult, very challenging discussion. As you know, countries have very different philosophies when it comes to data governance. So I don't think we can come up with brilliant solutions with, at the end of this 60-minute session, but we will try to discuss this with the potential solutions, potential sort of directions in terms of how we should think about this really important data governance issue in a global context. So let's start off with the Teruzawa-san, because he has been working very closely with the MITI, which, as you probably know, MITI.
MITI now.
No, but he is the one. He is the one who can actually talk about how this came about in terms of how why did Japanese government take this up as one of the most important agenda items for G20, and maybe you can give us an update in terms of what's happening, what's what's going on in terms of the progress. We have Osaka track as a follow-up of the G20 summit. So please go ahead, Teruzawa-san.
Okay, thank you very much. As Murakami-san said, this concept of data free flow with trust was first proposed by PM Abe at Davos in January. The concept is quite simple. You would need data free flow across country borders to harness the potential of data. And you would need trust so that people can feel comfortable sharing data. So it was, in our view, quite a straightforward idea. But the reality was very different. We had to struggle for 5 months after that to get this concept into the communique of the G20. Why was it so difficult? Maybe you might be surprised. A number of countries hesitated to make a commitment to data free flow. They wanted to keep the broad discretion by the governments to introduce regulation over data free flow. And we were surprised countries like India had a different interpretation to the concept of free. We had assumed free is no restriction. That we had understood. But Indians came up with a new concept that free may mean no compensation. For English language, free has two meanings: no restriction and no compensation. In Japanese, it's different. Free is no restriction. No compensation is tada in Japanese. So we have different interpretations. But Indian, they use English. They have two interpretations. In addition to stressing that no restriction to data flow, they have a difficulty making commitment. Additionally, sharing data without being compensated, will be against their national interest, because they consider, with a population of 1.3 billion, they consider data as to be the oil of the 21st century. Why should they be giving up that resources free, tada? So we encountered difficulties that we had not expected with the concept of data free flow. But with trust, we thought it was easy. But you might be surprised, countries like US was nervous. Why? Because they considered by adding the word with trust, it may be used by countries to justify introducing regulations to data free flow. So with all those concerns, we had to have our Prime Minister Abe personally intervening with the leaders of other countries to get this simple concept into the G20 communique. So, as you might imagine, the challenge ahead of us is much more difficult. It's not just putting a single line into the communique. Now we have to make this into reality. But for example, talking about trust, there's no consensus among the countries as to which element would constitute trust. Maybe some countries may make the argument that measures to protect the stability of the society would be a justification to restrict data flow. But many other countries would say that's going too far, too broad. Even with privacy, an element of which most countries would agree as a part of trust, as you know, there is a substantial difference in what you mean by privacy. Talking with the Europeans, they consider privacy as the core element of their basic human rights. And with that, they have established this GDPR framework to protect privacy. But for the US does not attach such a status to privacy. And currently, at the federal level, there is no framework to protect privacy in the US. So these are the challenges we have to overcome. And PM Abe announced that we are initiating the so-called Osaka Track. Osaka Track is the process to make the data free flow with trust into reality. So what are the actions? 3 actions with a time constraint. One action is to have a WTO negotiation on e-commerce. The predecessor to WTO, which was GATT, it started around 1950. It started with the rule on trade in goods. In 1995, when WTO was established after GATT, the WTO introduced rules on trade in services in 1995. And now with this digital economy, it is apparent that we need to have an international rule to govern data flow. So to ensure WTO to be relevant in this digital era, we believe it is obvious that we need to have an international rule to govern trade related to data. So we are aiming at next June, when the trade ministers will meet in Kazakhstan, to come up with a substantial progress in that negotiation for the WTO negotiation on e-commerce. The second area is that we need to develop a consensus on what we mean by privacy. With all due respect to her, OECD has been a leader in this aspect. Back in 1980s, 30 years ago, OECD came up with a guideline for privacy. It was updated in 2013, but with all the recent developments, we believe it needs to be updated. But even if we succeed in forming a consensus about privacy, each country will set up its own regulation to protect privacy. And they will be different. And companies, like most of you are from companies will struggle to have a smooth data flow across the borders because each country has different regimes. So we have to do our best to ensure that there will be interoperability among frameworks. One example is the EU-Japan adequacy decision. With the adequacy decision, data between EU and Japan can basically be flown freely. So we have to accelerate these kind of efforts so that we would have bilateral or trilateral or plurilateral frameworks to facilitate data flow among countries with different regimes. I have used too much time. I have spent so much time on the government initiatives, but governments cannot monopolize the data governance. The speed is so fast, it changes so fast, it's so diverse, and the advancement of technology is so fast. The governments cannot keep up with the technology advancement with our capability. Frankly, we are not paid as well as the Google engineers. How can we compete with them? How can we regulate with them? They got millions of dollars, 1 digit, 2 digits smaller. So we have to be working with the private sector to have a better data governance. This is a topic I will address later in today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Good point. Government or regulators always behind the private sector in terms of understanding of technology as well as its implications. So next, I would like to ask Oshima-san to discuss the private sector perspectives with regard to this important issue, especially if you could just mention what you would see as a potential benefits, and also maybe things that you don't want the governments to do. Regulators are just a little too much in terms of intervening your business. You can just go ahead and mention that as well, please.
Oh, thank you, Murakami-san. So thank you very much for really and then having me here. And I really touch on a little bit what I'm doing, in daily life. That I'm running joint venture companies of financial technologies backed by the Mizuho Group, and then Daiichi Life, and actually Nagaki-san sitting there, and then also Sompo Japan. So we last 4 or 5 years or so, and then we expand our reach to data analytics area as well. And then we provide kind of say a scoring model and then the online-based lending models without having the accounting data, just analyzing as the data based on the deposit movements, and then judge that if we could really lend the money to a startup company or SMEs, and which is a new area. But people say that now banking sectors have a lot of data, but in reality is that it's so tough to levy and transform the old-based, paper-based data into the digitalized data can be used for the more really deep analysis. And then we really try to capture the data newly to really when we make the the core models. So and then how actually we can use the old legacy data is also a big challenge. Probably that will be the same for government as well. And then as for the trustee, and then so sorry for my bosses, and it's not clear that I just came back from the Estonia, and so 16 Celsius difference is actually, and made me got a cough. When really after really and then going around the other countries that who actually and then use the data more efficiently. Especially in the personal data. And then I think, how you can really use the data is actually they're influenced by the social cultures on the government status or number of populations and the traditions. And then, Japan, which has the 130 million people living here, it would be very difficult to propose one single platform to capture all the personal data. So people say that when you go to the bank branch, and then you'd have to really spend so much time to register your record and then verify yourselves. But supposing that if the My Number card really contains many data, maybe can be really shared among all of the financial institutions. And I think how we could really mask personal data and then get the consent to really transfer the data to one single chip would really make the traditional business much smoother. And when we think of how we could really transform the say branch networks, that if we could capture all the data, put them into the one chip. Like people doing in the Northern European countries, we might be able to really shorten the time to really open the account and invest the money into the mutual funds, or maybe possibly can be used for the healthcare services people already live in local cities. So how we could really treat personal data and then capture those data to provide a better service is something really we need to discuss. If you are so afraid to change the society, at one time, you might be able to really test efficiencies of such new models by using probably special economic zone, or maybe in limited areas or cities in local areas. And then what I want to say is that we have to really move forward, and then the experiments first then we could really and then expand that approach to the other area as well. I think how Japanese companies also now use the data and they analyze data more. But the thing is that volume of the data sometimes are limited because the competition is very severe. And then already, the competitors try to capture the data as much as possible. Sometimes, really, by giving the additional points to capture the data, like a PayPay, or the very, and people really utilize those special benefits. But how you could really integrate the data and then to provide a better service is really key. Although we have 130 million people, I think that we do not really utilize such the richness of the data enough. So that's one challenge we have to try. And also one thing, and I want to add, is that when we talk about the data, people always think that data is about the personal data. But probably we can really distinguish the nature of the data. When you think of, say, agriculture data, climate data, or driving data, so it doesn't matter that who actually drive, and then which really farms will provide the data. So those data can be shared and among the society to really analyze the data and then provide better services. So we should distinguish personal data story and then the other issues like 5G, IoT things. So I stop here.
Thank you, Oshima-san. Next, Alex actually is the author of a book called Modern Monopolies. And for those who have not read his book, highly recommend it. Very, very interesting. The issue of monopoly is very, very deeply interlinked with the issue of privacy here. So he can definitely talk about not only privacy issue, but also the whole idea of monopoly in his comments, but also obviously this is a very important topic that's going on in the United States as well. So from a US perspective, maybe Alex, you can share your thought on this issue?
Sure. So the book is also in Japanese, by the way, and a few other Asian languages. But what the book says is there's a new business model. It's called the platform business model. Platform businesses are the dominant business model of the 21st century economy. And why is that? Well, platforms, they don't own the means of production. They create the means of connection, right? So if you think about Rakuten or Amazon or Google, their business is to facilitate the exchange of value, which means that they have a consumer and they have a producer. And the platform is sitting in between these two parties and helping them to exchange value, right? So if you think about the role of data, it's absolutely critical to enabling that exchange. What you also see is that these businesses have these things called network effects, winner-take-all dynamics, which means that there's only one or two dominant winners in any given space. No one wants to be the Windows phone, okay? You want to be either Google or Apple. But if you're Windows phone, it's not so good for you. There's only two winners, generally max, right? Uber or Lyft, et cetera, et cetera. So I've kind of 3 points here to just intro this, is the topic of legislation versus regulation, consumer privacy and what that means in the US or really lack thereof, and focusing on the producer. So legislation versus regulation. You may have heard about this thing called GDPR. GDPR is a travesty. GDPR actually helps Facebook and Google, okay? Zuckerberg and Sundar should be kissing the feet of the European legislators because post-GDPR, Google and Facebook have a greater degree of market share in digital advertising. Why is that, do you ask? Well, there are all these rules and laws and penalties if you don't comply with all of these laws. And then guess what happens? You get fined. Guess which two companies in Europe have the best technology and the best data to comply with these laws? Google and Facebook. So it actually just hurts the competition, and it actually counteracts what you were trying to do in the first place. So regulation is saying that which companies actually have the most amount of data? Tech monopolies, platform businesses at scale. What you need is very targeted, tailor-made regulation specifically on a company-by-company basis. The moment you try to make these widespread laws that apply to all companies, big and small or mid-size, you've really just kind of done more damage than you have done good. Consumer privacy. So in the US, you want to know who cares about consumer privacy? Because consumers don't care. The media cares and the politicians care. Consumers don't care. They actively use Facebook and Instagram and Google and Apple. They know what's going to happen with their data. They still use them. They still keep using them more and more and more. Consumers don't care about privacy. Politicians and media care about privacy. Another example of this. Apple recently struck a deal with the fifth largest EMR company. We've talked about health records in here. We have a law called HIPAA in the US, which is actually a big detriment to innovation in the healthcare industry in the United States because it puts all these privacy laws around the role of data in healthcare. So Apple did a deal with the fifth largest EMR company called Allscripts. The head of the data IT control in the government, US government, he actually got it right for a change. And he said, we want to give consumers the ability to put their health record into Apple Health. So if I say, hey, I want to share my health record with Apple Health, that should happen, right? It should be a seamless process. That's what the government is saying in the US. What happened? The American Medical Association and all of these large nonprofits said, no, we can't do that. Consumer privacy could be at risk. Consumers don't understand what could happen if they give their data to Apple. They're basically calling the American people stupid. You don't think the American people understand what happens if you give your data to Apple? I'm pretty sure they can understand that. And the way HIPAA works is if you say, I want to give my data, you can sign off and you can kind of get around the rules of HIPAA. So guess who funds the American Medical Association in the US? Pharma companies. It's the incumbents. The incumbents don't want innovation and data free flow and disruption. They want things to stay locked down. They want you to be concerned about privacy. Consumers, frankly, don't care, and rightly so. So instead, the thing that when you look at tech monopolies that you really need to focus on are the producers. When tech monopolies become monopolies scale, if you think there's those two customer groups, right? I'm a website on Google, or I'm making an app on the iPhone, or I'm driving for Uber. Right? It's the suppliers of value that are actually disadvantaged when a platform gets to monopoly scale. So what that means is what the FTC just launched a probe is into the role of Amazon third-party sellers. And I gave some examples to our friends over there, and I said, if you're a product manager at Amazon, you can request this thing called a purchase order from a third-party seller on Amazon. And I guarantee you, if the FTC probes into those emails, what they'll find is that those Amazon product managers got the PO, and then they went directly to the manufacturer of those products, circumventing the third-party seller on Amazon. What producers are disadvantaged by is how the platform uses the data against the supplier. Whether that's Google copying Yelp, TripAdvisor, and other websites' content, making that as their own, and then prioritizing it in their search engine rankings, or the Amazon example. There's a myriad, or you're an Uber driver and you get kicked off the platform, right? That is the role of where government could help to alleviate the disadvantage that producers are put at when platforms get to monopoly scale. But that's not an attractive topic because that's a very small portion of the population. That's 1% of the population that are actually driving for Uber or having your website ripped off by Google, or Spotify just sued Apple a few months ago. Funny enough, last point here is Zuckerberg has actually asked for regulation. Why has Zuckerberg asked for regulation? Because he says, again, on the producer side, Facebook is never going to understand when we should be taking down abusive content or where we're violating free speech. And the government should provide regulation and guidance on what is the appropriate role of us regulating and curating our ecosystem of content creators. Those are the producers. And so if you're a content creator, you get kicked off Facebook or YouTube, you have no recourse, you have no one to go to, because it's just the platform that's making the decision. And so this is where platforms actually want the regulation, but the government is actually staying out of it, which is the opposite of what's happening in China, which I can get into if that's of interest.
Interesting, thank you. Jenny, you're the only economist, so I hope you can give us a economist perspective in terms of what data means in the traditional macroeconomic framework. Obviously has a very different role as what you used to think in terms of what data could do, but now it's we're in a different world. So Jenny, can you comment on this for a couple minutes, please?
Thanks very much. It's always difficult to be the last speaker after such a great set of interventions and to be the economist on the panel. You know, economists are the world's most boring people. Robbie, you'll agree with me. And so let me give you some of the nuts and bolts about how we might think about some of these issues and just hope it isn't too dry. So the first thing I want to talk about is the economics of data. And the first thing I want to say is data is not the oil of the new economy. Okay, so you hear that phrase a lot, but just think about this for a minute. Oil is what economists call a rival good, right? One country uses up oil, there's less of it for everybody else. There's a limited supply of oil in the world. Data is totally different. Okay, data is a non-rival good. However much of it there is out there, however much of it one company or person uses, it's still there and everybody else can still use it. Okay, so the way we think about the economics of a good like that's very different from how you regulate something like oil. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The other thing about data is that so far as we have any evidence, it is subject to diminishing returns to scale. Okay, so it's not the kind of thing where bigger is always better, more data is always better. Okay, and again, that makes sense. If you think about trips to the airport, okay, the first 3 times you go to the airport, you learn something new each time you go. The 10th, 15th, 20th time you go to the airport, the information is not worth very much. Okay, now that is broadly true of lots of kinds of information, that there's a point beyond which collecting more of the same information isn't that valuable. Okay, so what that tells you is that this is not actually, data itself is not actually something that automatically leads to natural monopolies, okay? Just being the biggest owner of data is not actually necessarily that important. Now, the reason for that is that data, we don't actually understand the value of data. There aren't really markets for data, and we don't have prices for data. Data, just the little bytes of information. Where data becomes valuable is when you transform it into knowledge. Okay, when you do something with data, you analyze it, you put it through an algorithm, you transform it into a form that can be used in that way, and then you use it. Now, knowledge production, the economics of knowledge production, we know a lot more about. Okay, again, knowledge production is something that's been going on for a very long time. Books represent knowledge. Okay, newspapers represent knowledge. Movies, music, all of those creative things, those represent the input of some kind of analytical process that gives us an output that you would call knowledge or a creation. We do have markets for those. We do have valuations for those. We understand the nature of intellectual property of those things, and so we can think much more sensibly about how that market operates. And here it gets difficult to know what kind of market structure we actually expect to see. Because on the one hand, it may be that actually producing more knowledge is basically subject to constant returns to scale. It's roughly, takes the same amount of effort to produce the next book as it did the last one. But there may be some kind of knowledge production in which learning by doing becomes really important. So new forms of knowledge creation, algorithms and the way in which we do use AI now to transform data into knowledge, all of that may very well be subject to the economies of learning by doing. That is, if you've been doing it already, you're going to be better at doing it. And somebody who's trying to come in new is not going to be so good at doing it. And so you can then get concentrations of market power, the kind of thing that Alex has been talking about. And you do get incentives for the incumbents to collude. And therefore, you do have an argument for regulation of that part of the market. At the same time, though, there is, on the other side, a force, if you like, for good. That is, as the producers of the platforms get bigger and better at what they do, that reduces the need for users of their services to do everything in-house. You know, as a new startup company, you don't have to have a giant computer to do all your own data analysis. You can buy that service. So you get a specialization, and that can create the possibility for new industries to grow up that actually can buy in services. And so that's the positive side, that why you want to allow a certain amount of specialization in the platform stage. Okay, now I'm running out of time, so let me just turn very quickly to say two other things about what economic research has told us that's relevant to our discussion. One point is about, if we've got market structure, we understand a bit about market structure, what do we think about geography? Does geography matter? Are countries going to get to be particularly good at something? Do we expect to see particular places have comparative advantage in doing some of these new things or not? Now, you know, your first reaction might be, in a digital economy, what does it matter where something takes place, right? We can do it all online. Geography shouldn't matter at all. The evidence that's beginning to mount is suggesting that actually, because there are complementarities between the sort of skills you need to effectively do the learning by doing and become skilled at the platform and knowledge creation, that we actually may see certain countries get to be, and of course that goes with our instincts, that we may see certain countries get to be particularly good at doing certain parts of this value supply chain, but it won't be just to do with the amount of data they have or the number of platform companies they have. It will be because of the policy combinations they've got in place that create the skills and the regulatory environment that enable them to do that. And so then, of course, the discussion about regulatory marrying up of consistency of regulation and of the way in which countries deal with each other about the free flow of data becomes bound up with their political economy, of what it is they've done to create a comparative advantage in whatever part of that supply chain they may have established it. And I think that helps to explain Terazawa-san's the difficulty that Japan has faced in the data free flow. The final thing I want to say is just about the economics of privacy, and it's because Alex has made this controversial proposition that consumers don't care about privacy. So I just want to share with you the fact that there is research actually about how do consumers value privacy. This is really tricky to do, of course. Because, again, there's no market out there. We don't know what the value of privacy is. But economists have started to work in behavioral economics and do experiments, ask people, okay? What we find is that consumers are deeply confused. How many of you are confused about data privacy? When you click on that button that says, do you agree to our terms? How much of the stuff did you read? Do you know what the company's actually going to do? Right. So when you do these experiments with consumers, what you find is that the amount the consumers are willing to pay to protect their privacy is different from the amount that they would accept to sell their private information. Now, that actually doesn't make much sense, right? Those two things should be very close in valuation, but they are not. And the answers to those sort of questions also depends on age and education and a bunch of things that are about the consumer, but they also depend on whether the consumer believes that they have protection of their private information already, or whether they believe that that is already so compromised that their private decision makes very little difference. What that tells us is that what we desperately need is education and transparency, and that if we're going to do anything effective in regulation in these areas, it's going to have to be around that, because without that we can't actually make sensible decisions.
So just a little quick follow-up. Amazon, I think a few months ago, was offering people $10 to basically agree to much more egregious terms of service to sell their data. So the price there was $10. And then there was another study that said, how much would you pay for all of these free apps from tech monopolies, right? It could be Amazon, Facebook, Instagram, the different Google apps that are all free. The scale was between $4 a month up to $10 a month, right? So when you want to just kind of look at all the value that these platforms are giving you in free software and ecosystems and all these things, that's at least, right, almost $50 a year versus I'll pay you $10 for your data. So what that comes down to is if there is a cost to privacy, that cost to privacy is drastically outweighed in the positive end of the spectrum by the value that these platforms are giving you for free. And you're basically just seeing that in their usage and growth and all of these other metrics.
Well, there's a really interesting sort of a incident that took place in Japan, just relating to the comments you made. It is true that I think a lot of people feel like they're getting a really good deal in terms of using the free platforms. In Japan, there's a really unfortunate incident where a very large recruiting company misused the information or data of, I don't know how many, a very big number of users. So not until an incident like that happens, you realize, oh my gosh, this is actually not something that you can take for granted. In terms of again, goes back to the issue of trust. How much trust, do we have in terms of these platformers or other big companies who are using your private data? So I think it's a reminder that the trust issue is really important when it comes to these platforms who are providing a lot of really good services, but at the same time, complaints will not be heard until this trust issue comes up in the consumer mind. So I think that's something that was kind of timely in terms of, we're discussing this issue right now. But Alex, I want to ask another question, just following up your earlier comments. You were about to say something about China, because again, do consumers care? I think it's very different in terms of what sort of, answer you may get depending on the country. You're talking about, do you think Chinese consumers care more or less? And how does it affect in terms of where China, stands in this whole global competitive environment in terms of having platformers from China, platformers from other countries?
I'd say in the U.S., there's probably a lot of trust with the platforms from the consumer standpoint. There's a lot of mistrust in terms of government getting access to your data in the U.S. on the individual kind of citizen level. A lot of distrust there. And in China, there's this, there's basically a rise of two internets, right? There's what China's done with the Great Firewall, and now you're seeing that exported to other friendly nations like Russia. I was reading something about Uganda. And so what you see in China just very differently is that the role of government and their tech monopolies, the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, there's actually a mid-level U.S. State Department official last week that was equating that the Chinese tech monopolies were extensions of the Chinese government Communist Party. And basically that they are one and the same in the sense that what is the data running through the Chinese tech monopoly, and does the government have sufficient access to that, and is the tech company regulating that data and their ecosystem appropriately? And if you actually look at Chinese tech monopoly stocks over the past year or two, they're actually highly suppressed because these tech companies have been getting in trouble with the Chinese government because they're not doing a good enough job to regulate data and the behavior. So how does the Chinese consumer feel about that? I don't know, but I would guess not so well. But I'm not an expert in that.
Thank you. So just wanted to switch gears. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is likely to happen in terms of this very important discussion in terms of what governments can do or should do to provide a little bit better directions in terms of the regulatory environment, where many countries, not all countries, I realize it's impossible, but most major countries can basically say, yeah, I can live with that. We can live with that. General guidelines, and obviously, those guidelines would have to be broken down into legal frameworks in each country. But at least on a at least at the sort of top level, there should be something as far as the Japanese government is concerned in terms of what they're proposing, where everyone can just say, oh yeah, we can work with this framework, we can work with this guidelines. And Terazawa-san, you said earlier in our discussion, prep discussion, you don't really want to see discussion going all the way to the sort of European, more extreme discussion where GDPR is really pushing more privacy protection, and quite frankly, as Alex pointed out, that may be hurting the competitive environment in the European market, maybe other markets as well on a global basis. So Terazawa, can you just talk about where it should go, where it's going? I know it's a hard one.
I know that time is running out. Difficult question, but I think people do understand the issue of trust is being elevated. 5 years ago, it might have not been a problem. People just click the button and say, yes, I consent. But now the age of the Wild West is over, I think. There has to be a better data governance to enhance trust among the people. But that does not mean excessive regulation. Historically, if you tried to enhance trust, you had to have more regulation. That was the typical way we responded. But as I suggested, we cannot have the best data governance by the governments to deal with this monster. We have to work with the private sector, and I think we have to have a better governance innovation. As the digital economy is innovating the business world, the government has to be more innovative. We have to, in a sense, co-regulate with the industry. What do I mean? One example is, just hypothetically, the government sets the principle or the frameworks, and the details will be decided by the industries or the companies. And if they go off the limits, maybe the government can intervene. But rather than prescribing every small details, it's better to come up with a framework, principle, and let the private sector decide, and the government will just kick in only if there is a problem. That is one way. In the past, the government certified everything, but we cannot. It may be left to the private sector organization to certify the adequacy of privacy protection, for example. And maybe in the past historical regulation, we had the same regulation applied to everyone. But as Alex said, the regulation may have to be different based on the risk or based on the players. So these are the kind of new regulation we have to introduce, not just by the government. The government's regulation has to be innovative, but working with the private sector. So that's where I think we are working to try to realize both the enhancement of trust, but at the same time avoiding overregulation and being conducive to innovation and business. That's the challenge we're facing.
Washima-san, are you happy with that comment as a private sector representative of Japan?
Well, that's very difficult to really, find the right answer here. But having said so, still I think there's something that the public sector and the private sector really work together. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that thinking of really local governments, and then, as I said, that trust can be maintained in a small, number of populations. So if it can be applied to small cities, everybody knows each other, and then the data, like personal data, can be stored in the under the one umbrella. It's possible, and then, for example, property transactions, still you have to go to the offices to really get a record, and then you have to register it. So I think that transaction can be done in seconds if the all data are really digital based. So that's example still, and then we have to kick off. So and private sector as well, and then we really probably we could really cooperate with the other companies as well to form the necessary common platforms, which could really and then our business much more efficient. And nobody really want to spend so much time to explain all of the details of the investments or checking the personal data by paper. And then those things probably we could really work together with public sector side, and probably we could share the data with other companies to really richen the data. And then by masking all the personal data is still possible. So we should learn more, and then we should recognize that the differences, and then how much you need to really protect personal data. And then according to some statistics survey, that age 20s, 30s millennium people who really love to live with smartphones do not care much about personal data. Rather really wants to get more services. But age 50, 60 over, and still probably too nervous. And we really have to find one really more compromised way, and the middle way to then speed up the processes.
We actually have to move to the Q&A session, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, and maybe you can start with the gentleman over there.
Thank you. Paul Bradley from Caprica International, live in Singapore. There are almost three models if we simplify, right? There's the US model where data is free-flowing within the corporate structure. Europe has over-regulated data, as was mentioned, and China has tightly controlled full access to data, centralized through the government. Now, artificial intelligence requires machine learning. The more data you have access to, the more AI evolves. So we've already defined that the US and China will be driving the AI future, because if you over-control data access as Europe has, you basically restrict the ability of machine learning AI to evolve. So we've almost forced, with the data information, the US and China are already defined as the drivers of AI because of this.
Can you just ask your question?
The question is, China has the social credit score system now, which will affect almost everything with Chinese lives. So which model do you feel is the solution between the European, the US, and the Chinese model, and how it affects the AI future?
All right, that's a hard one. Which model? Because the gaps are so big among these three, well, potentially, actually three for now, models that he mentioned. Jenny, do you have any comments to that? And maybe Alex after that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is well, I agree that there are broadly typologies of model. I don't think that the outlook is quite so gloomy about the impact on AI and the ability to develop. So, I don't think Europe's dead yet. And the reason is that there are lots of types of data, as was mentioned before. I think it was Oshima-san said, there's data that is much less tightly regulated for good reason. It's not personal data. The other thing is that with AI, it's not directly the quantity of data that you need. So you can certainly do a lot of training of your AI algorithms on the basis of a certain amount of data. You need other kinds of data for feedback and improvement. So there's a lot you can still do within those regulatory frameworks, first thing. Second thing is that the range of country models is quite interesting. And if you look around the region here, Asia and APEC, as you probably know, there are already real efforts to make the regimes interact without necessarily making them all the same. So APEC has done a lot of work on developing principles by which there could then be sort of mutual recognition. ASEAN, which is typically we think of as being not a place that's very good at doing regulatory governance and getting things organised across boundaries, but they've actually, gone a long way in discussing whether they are going to simply use the APEC rules, because that will help. And then you have the possibility of doing mutual recognition sort of agreements of the kind that Terazawa-san mentioned, where so that you can get cross-border flow of a quite big amount of data. There will be areas where there will be no-go areas, but there will be areas where there is going to be free trade in data. And so I'm much more optimistic than you sound about that.
Alex, do you have any comments on that as well?
I mean, if I had to pick between the three, I would vote with the U.S. I think the new European kind of Miss Vestager, who's taken over their regulatory chief post, she does grasp onto this regulating the producer concept very well, but the GDPR stuff, as I mentioned, went too far. The Great Firewall and that prospect in China is just, it's unfortunate because platforms do create so much value for all of their different constituents and stakeholders. And when you have such a close coupling between state and tech company, tech monopoly, it starts to erode a lot of those benefits that would otherwise be present if there's more separation between state and the private sector.
Thank you. Any other questions? And please keep your question relatively short. Okay, じゃあどうぞお願いします。はい。
This is a question to Alex. I really enjoyed your discussion and presentation today, and actually I bought your book through Amazon during this presentation. What a convenient world. You said about the platformers can kick out producers, and I think there's an inherent power to the platformers to, to monopolize the market. And what kind of regulation are you thinking that could prevent those monopolies to happen?
So we wanted concrete recommendations, right? One other question too?
Should I take one more? Okay.
You can do rapid fire.
So, Anders Carlton, Elsevier. This is about data-driven economies, data free flow with trust, but we heard that the value comes partly from AI. At the last G20, there was also a supplement around ethics of AI. Could someone comment how that part of AI together with data will come in with respect to various regulations, and how come this was included in the G20?
Okay, well, let's just start off with the first question. Alex, maybe you can just comment on that.
I'll do that quickly. 3 concrete recommendations. Empower regulators. In the US, that's the FTC. I think there's also an FTC here in Japan. Empower regulators to take specific action on a company-by-company basis at the tech monopoly level. In 2 specific areas. One around transparency. So they have these matchmaking algorithms. That's Google Page Rank, Amazon's Product Rank. When you search for products, provide transparency around how that algorithm is performing those matches. You've seen them prioritize or give preferential treatment to their own sites or their own products, and that's naturally in conflict. Secondly is if a producer is kicked off or does try to rebut a penalty that the platform takes on them, provide a forum that the government could help set up for producers that feel like they've been unfairly harmed or need to have a second opinion, provide a means that they could actually have that second opinion that's independent from the platform, adjudicate that.
Just on the second question, I can just briefly mention that it's actually OECD AI principles. I'm with OECD. So if you look at it, and again, you can look at what is included in principles which have been agreed and endorsed by the G20 countries. It's really the idea is let's not use AI to kill people. let's use it for, good use, good for people. And, I'm just making a very, very simple comment here. It does have a lot of different elements. But in principle, what they want to do is to make sure applications of AI benefit people and really try to stay away from, harmful applications. Quite frankly, if you look at them, you can see how broad, how general these items are, which may be difficult in terms of having a real impact, because that's the second step, and quite frankly, that may take a little longer than just having these principles, endorsed by these countries, because again, that becomes legal questions and regulatory questions. So we're not there yet, but at least to give you a sense in terms of why it was included in the G20 discussion, we just wanted to set the tone, the right tone, which is to say, well, let's use it to make sure no one gets killed. Well, not only the military usage, but other potential harmful applications. Am I right? Yes. Sure. Okay, thank you.
This is not controversial.
And this was actually, it was a relatively easy one. Okay, last question. With one more question, I'll take. Very quickly, please.
Yes, this question is to Terasawa-san and Oshima-san, because I don't think no one disagrees this data flow with trust. But the thing is, the biggest data holder is the government. How ready, how free the government, the Japanese government in particular, is to provide this, services. And I would like to have that as a provider and a data user.
Frankly, you might be surprised. We have requested, we have opened up the channel to receive requests from the private sector for access to the private sector, for the public sector, data from the public sector. And you might be surprised, we have not received too many requests from the private sector. There are some issues, data, as the medical data or my card kind of data. So we are aware of certain areas in which we need to do a better job in providing data owned or controlled by the government. But frankly, to make change, the private sector would have to come up with us with specific requests for opening up of the data from the government sector. I was surprised. I thought the same way as you are saying. But frankly speaking, very little request is coming from the private sector. Having said so, we need to do a better job in sharing the data of medical-related data. We do have a system to anonymize data, but that has been probably too much restrictive. So we are opening up our channels to improve that, transforming the privacy data into a more anonymous data with usefulness. These are the areas in which we are willing to work. So if the question is the will on the government side, yes, we are. But it has to come from the private sector as well. And additionally, we have to deal with the media, that we will be constantly criticized for trying to use the data associated with my card to other uses. We have to face the public opinion against using the data collected by the government. That's where we need the support from the private sector as well. So the private sector has a great role, putting inputs to us and also defending our challenge to open up data for those sensitive information. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And the one thing I want to mention is that now for example, healthcare data's case, all the data is still written in the paper. And then, means that how we could really commit to, transform the systems to really record that, all transactions as a, digital base. Then we will start. So even that we just talk on the data who would use and then who really want to use, the first thing that we need to really transform the systems to be more suitable to data-oriented societies.
Thank you. I know we could go on forever, but we need to wrap it up now. And please give the panel a big hand. Thank you.